August 14th, 1945. The sun hadn't yet risen over Tokyo when the news crackled through military radio frequencies across the Pacific. Emperor Hirohito's voice, never before heard by most Japanese citizens, announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over. 6 days of chaos, celebration, and confusion followed. And then, in the middle of all that madness, someone decided to play a baseball game. Not just any baseball game, the game that military officials explicitly forbade. The game that could have reignited tensions that had just begun to cool. The game that brought together two groups of men who, by all accounts of history, logic, and military protocol, should never have shared the same field. This is the story of how a split-second decision by a young lieutenant, a beat-up leather baseball, and 9 innings of impossible tension created a moment that would echo through history far louder than anyone standing there that day could have imagined. But to understand why this game mattered, we need to rewind. Not just days or weeks, but years. Because the story doesn't start on a baseball diamond. It starts in the absolute depths of human darkness. The Philippines, 1942. When Japanese forces captured American and Filipino troops at Bataan, what followed became known as one of the war's greatest atrocities, the Bataan Death March. 75,000 prisoners forced to march 65 miles in scorching heat. No food, barely any water. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. Men who asked for water were shot. Men who helped their fellow soldiers were beaten to death. Those who survived the march arrived at camps where conditions were so horrific that death became a daily occurrence. Starvation, disease, torture, casual brutality that stripped away every shred of humanity. For 3.5 years, these men endured hell, and the men guarding them, the men inflicting this suffering, were Japanese soldiers following orders in a war machine that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor and prisoners as beneath contempt. Now, imagine those same guards and prisoners on a baseball field together. Impossible, right? That's what everyone thought. The guards had a name the prisoners used in whispers. They called them the lizards because of the way they seemed to watch everything with cold, unblinking eyes. The camp commanders were even worse, earning nicknames that can't be repeated here, but reflected the absolute terror they inspired. Lieutenant Hideo Kobayashi was different, though. At least that's what some prisoners noticed. He was young, maybe 23, with an unusual hesitation in his movements when orders became particularly brutal. He'd been drafted from Osaka, where his family ran a small business. Before the war consumed everything, he'd played baseball in school. He was terrible at it, but he loved it anyway. The prisoners didn't know this about him. They just knew he was one of the guards, one of them, and that was enough. When liberation finally came in early September 1945, the emotional whiplash was indescribable. Men who'd resigned themselves to death suddenly faced the possibility of life. The Japanese guards, meanwhile, faced an unknown fate. Some expected immediate execution, others hoped for basic mercy. The American forces arriving to process the camps and begin repatriation had strict orders. Keep the groups separated, minimize interaction, process everyone efficiently, and get the former prisoners medical attention and transport home as quickly as possible. The last thing anyone wanted was an incident that could complicate the already delicate post-surrender situation. Camp Kimura, about 40 miles outside Manila, became one of the processing centers. 1,500 former prisoners waiting for transport, 300 Japanese guards and soldiers waiting for, well, nobody was quite sure what, and a small contingent of American military personnel trying to manage the whole situation with a rulebook that hadn't yet been written. The compound had been a Japanese military installation before the surrender. It had, improbably, a decent-sized field that the Japanese soldiers had used for training exercises. And in the supply building, someone found a collection of baseball equipment. Bats, balls, gloves, bases. All American equipment that had been captured early in the war. This is where Lieutenant Jack Morrison enters our story. 26 years old, from a small town in Ohio, Morrison had been a minor league baseball player before the war. Not good enough for the majors, but skilled enough that everyone in his hometown knew his name. He'd spent 2 years in the Pacific Theater, seen combat at Guadalcanal in Leyte, and volunteered for the processing assignment because he spoke some Japanese, learned from a college roommate. Morrison was inspecting the supply building when he found the baseball equipment. He stood there for a long moment, running his hands over a bat that still smelled faintly of linseed oil despite years of storage. And that's when the idea hit him, the absolutely insane, potentially catastrophic, completely unauthorized idea. The former prisoners had been receiving better food and medical care for several days, but the psychological wounds were still raw. Most could barely look at their former captors without rage flooding their systems. The trauma was so fresh, so overwhelming, that counselors and chaplains moved through the camps trying to help men process the impossible task of returning to a world that had continued without them. Morrison had noticed something, though. A handful of the former prisoners would gather in the evenings near the field, just sitting, not talking much. One of them had found a baseball somewhere, and they'd pass it around. Nothing organized, just the feel of the leather, the weight of it, something familiar in a world that had become unrecognizable. He'd also noticed that some of the Japanese soldiers, during their limited exercise time, would glance at the field with something that looked almost like longing. The idea was crazy. His commanding officer would shut it down immediately if he asked permission. It violated at least a dozen different protocols. It could start a riot. It could reignite violence. It could create an international incident that would embarrass everyone involved. But Morrison couldn't shake the thought. Both groups had been dehumanized by the war in different ways. What if, just for a few hours, they could be human again? Not guards and prisoners, not victors and defeated, just men playing a game. He started with the former prisoners, casually, carefully. Any of you guys ever play baseball? Most ignored him. A few nodded. One, a sergeant from Texas named Ray Hutchins, actually responded. Played in high school, first base, lifetime ago. Morrison nodded. Found some equipment. Thought maybe some folks might want to play. Get your minds off things for a bit. Hutchins looked at him like he'd suggested they sprout wings and fly home. Play baseball? Here? Now? Why not? War's over, we're just waiting on transport. Might as well do something normal. Several other former prisoners had drifted closer, listening. Morrison could feel their skepticism, their exhaustion, their bone-deep weariness with anything that required hope or effort. But then one of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, spoke up. I'll play. I'll play anything that makes me feel human again. That broke the dam. Others nodded. Within an hour, Morrison had 18 former prisoners who were willing, if not enthusiastic, to field 2 teams for a game. The next part was harder. The Japanese guards were housed in a separate section under watch but not imprisoned. They spent their days in a strange limbo, uncertain of their fate, cut off from their families, processing their own trauma and defeat. Morrison approached them during their afternoon exercise period. He'd brought an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier named Kenji Tanaka who'd grown up in California and volunteered for military intelligence work. Morrison's pitch was simple. Some of the American former prisoners want to play baseball. We're short players. Any of you play? The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse the sky. The Japanese soldiers looked at each other, then at Morrison, then at nothing. The idea was so absurd, so unexpected, that none of them knew how to respond. Tanaka translated, then added his own observation in Japanese. The lieutenant is serious. He thinks it might be good for everyone. One of the older Japanese soldiers shook his head. We cannot. We are prisoners. They hate us. They should hate us. Morrison didn't need the translation to understand the body language. He pressed on. War's over. You guys played baseball before all this, right? I saw the field. Somebody here knows the game. That's when Kobayashi stepped forward. In halting English, he said, I play. Not good, but I play. His words hung in the air like smoke. The other Japanese soldiers stared at him, some with shock, some with something that might have been hope, one with clear disapproval. Morrison seized the moment. Great, who else? It took another 30 minutes of discussion, debate, and what appeared to be heated argument among the Japanese soldiers, but eventually 9 of them agreed. 9 men willing to step onto a baseball field with former prisoners who had every reason to want them dead. Morrison knew he was out of time. He needed to act before anyone with actual authority found out and shut the whole thing down. He scheduled the game for the next afternoon, spread the word to both groups, and then spent a sleepless night wondering if he just made the biggest mistake of his military career. The next day arrived with oppressive heat and air so humid it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Word had spread through the compound, not officially, nobody made announcements, but somehow everyone knew. The American former prisoners knew, the Japanese soldiers knew, the small contingent of American military personnel knew. And everyone had an opinion, most of them negative. Several former prisoners confronted Morrison that morning. You're letting us play baseball with those animals? Are you insane? The speaker was trembling with rage, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Those men tortured us, they killed our friends, and you want us to play a game with them? Morrison had no good answer. Nothing he could say would make it right, or okay, or justified. So he just told the truth. Nobody has to play, it's voluntary. But for the guys who want to, I think maybe it's a way to start processing this, to start being human again. Human? They're not human. They proved that every single day for 3 years. Maybe, or maybe the war made monsters out of everyone, and now we get to decide if we stay monsters or try to be something else. It didn't satisfy anyone, but the game was still on. Around 3 in the afternoon, Morrison walked onto the field carrying the equipment. Behind him came the 18 former prisoners who'd volunteered. They moved slowly, bodies still recovering from years of deprivation, but they moved with purpose. From the other side of the compound came the 9 Japanese soldiers who'd agreed to play. They walked in tight formation, eyes down, as if facing a firing squad rather than a baseball game. The 2 groups met at the field and stopped. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet. It felt like 20 miles. Nobody spoke. Morrison realized he hadn't thought this part through. How do you start something like this? What are the rules? What's appropriate? He stepped into the middle. Okay, here's how this works. We're playing baseball, actual baseball, with actual rules. We've got 18 Americans, so we'll field 2 teams of 9. The Japanese players will join one of the American teams to even things out. Silence. Then Hutchins, the former first baseman from Texas, spoke up. They join our teams? Yes, we're playing mixed teams, Americans and Japanese together. The reaction was immediate and loud. Several former prisoners started shouting. A few of the Japanese soldiers stepped back as if expecting violence. The whole thing threatened to collapse before a single pitch was thrown. Morrison raised his voice. Listen to me. We can stand here divided, carrying all this hate and trauma until it kills us from the inside, or we can play 9 innings of baseball and see if maybe, just maybe, we can find a different way forward. Your choice. But if you're here, you're playing by my rules, and my rules say we play together. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Hutchins sighed, a sound of exhaustion and resignation and something that might have been courage. Fine, but I'm not speaking to any of them. Don't have to speak, just have to play. They divided into teams. Morrison tried to balance skill levels, though honestly, he had no idea who could actually play. The former prisoners were physically depleted, the Japanese soldiers were psychologically defeated. This was going to be a mess no matter how he organized it. Team 1 ended up with Hutchins at first base, 3 other former prisoners filling the infield, and 4 more in the outfield. Kobayashi, the young Japanese lieutenant who'd spoken up first, was placed in right field. Team 2 had a similar mix. Morrison put himself at shortstop, figuring he could at least keep the game moving. The remaining Japanese soldiers were spread across both teams, mostly in outfield positions. They had one umpire. Tanaka, the Japanese-American interpreter, volunteered. He'd played in college before the war and knew the rules cold. More importantly, both sides seemed willing to accept his calls. Morrison held up the baseball. It was scuffed and old, the stitching slightly loose, but it was a baseball, real and solid and familiar. "Play ball," he said, and threw it to the pitcher for Team 1. The first inning was excruciating. The pitcher, a former prisoner named Danny O'Connor from New York, threw like his arm was made of rust. The batter, one of the Japanese soldiers whose name Morrison didn't know, swung at pitches in the dirt and over his head. When he finally made contact on the 7th pitch, the ball dribbled toward third base. He ran to first. Everyone forgot to throw. It was less baseball and more a parody of baseball. Men who'd forgotten how to play. Men whose bodies couldn't do what their memories insisted they once could. Men so overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation that they moved like they were underwater. But then, something shifted. It happened in the 3rd inning. Hutchins was batting. He'd already struck out once and grounded out once. He was frustrated. You could see it in the tension of his shoulders. The pitcher threw a pitch right down the middle. Hutchins connected. The crack of the bat echoed across the field. The ball sailed high and deep. Kobayashi, in right field, took off running. He covered ground faster than seemed possible for someone who'd claimed he wasn't good at baseball. He reached the fence line, extended his glove, and caught the ball. Hutchins was already halfway to second base when the catch was made. He stopped, staring at Kobayashi in disbelief. Then, without thinking, he shouted, "Hell of a catch!" Kobayashi, breathing hard, nodded, just a slight dip of his head. But something in his expression changed. For a second, just a second, he wasn't a defeated enemy soldier. He was an outfielder who'd made a good play. That moment broke something open. The game got better. Not good, exactly. The skill level was still terrible, but the effort intensified. Men started trying harder, started moving with purpose, started caring about the outcome. By the 5th inning, players were encouraging each other, not across enemy lines yet, but within their own ranks. Good throw, nice swing, shake it off. The sounds of baseball, the language of the game started filling the field. Morrison, playing shortstop, found himself getting lost in it. For stretches of time, he forgot where he was, forgot the context. He was just a guy playing baseball on a hot afternoon. It was the most normal he'd felt in 4 years. The breakthrough came in the 7th inning. Team 2 was up by 3 runs. Team 1 had a runner on second with 2 outs. The batter was one of the Japanese soldiers, a thin man with a scar running down his left arm. He worked the count to 3-2. Then the pitcher threw what was meant to be a curveball but came in straight and slow. The batter connected perfectly. The ball rocketed toward the gap between center and right field. Morrison watched from shortstop as both the center fielder, a former prisoner, and Kobayashi in right field raced toward the ball. They converged at the same spot. For a split second, Morrison thought they might collide, thought the tension might explode into violence. Instead, at the last moment, the center fielder shouted, "You got it!" Kobayashi caught the ball. The inning was over. And as he jogged back toward the infield, the center fielder jogged beside him. They didn't talk, didn't look at each other, but they jogged in parallel, 2 men who'd played their positions correctly. That's when Morrison realized that something impossible was happening. The game was working. Not healing anyone, not fixing anything. The trauma was still there. The atrocities were still real. The horror of the past years hadn't been erased. But for 9 innings, these men were playing baseball. And in playing baseball, they were acknowledging each other's humanity. They were saying, without words, that maybe there was a world where they weren't just guards and prisoners, victors and defeated. Maybe they could be something else, even if just for today, even if just for 9 innings. The 8th inning brought the most unexpected moment. Hutchins was on first base. Kobayashi came up to bat. They were on the same team, though they'd barely acknowledged each other all game. Kobayashi swung at the first pitch and missed badly. The second pitch was in the dirt. On the third pitch, he made contact, but it was a weak grounder toward the second baseman. Hutchins took off running from first. The second baseman bobbled the ball slightly. There was going to be a play at second base. Hutchins slid, hard and fast. The throw came in. The shortstop caught it and swept down for the tag. "Safe," Tanaka called from his umpire position. Hutchins stood up, brushing dirt off his pants. He was safe at second. Kobayashi was safe at first. They'd successfully executed a fundamental baseball play. Not as enemies, as teammates. Hutchins glanced back at Kobayashi. Their eyes met. For a second, Morrison saw Hutchins's face twist with confusion, anger, pain, all the rage and trauma threatening to surface. Then Hutchins nodded. Just once. A tiny acknowledgement. Kobayashi nodded back. Nobody scored that inning. Team 1 was still down by 2, but something had shifted. The weight on the field felt different, lighter somehow. Going into the 9th inning, Team 2 led 5-3. Team 1 was up to bat. Morrison was coaching third base, watching as his players came up one by one. They were exhausted. Everyone was exhausted, but nobody wanted the game to end. 2 quick outs, a single, then Hutchins came up to bat with a runner on first. The count went to 3-2. The entire field went quiet. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the wind moving through the trees at the edge of the compound, could hear the collective breath of every person watching. The pitch came in. Hutchins swung. The crack of the bat was clean and pure. The ball sailed over the left fielder's head. The runner on first raced around the bases. Hutchins chugged around first, heading towards second. The left fielder retrieved the ball and threw it in, but the runner scored. Hutchins pulled into second base with a double. The game was now 5-4. 1-run game, 1 out left. The next batter was one of the Japanese soldiers. Morrison didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but he watched as the young man took practice swings, his face tight with concentration. First pitch, strike. Second pitch, ball. Third pitch, fouled off. Fourth pitch, ball. Fifth pitch, another foul. The pitcher wound up for the 6th pitch. Morrison saw it leave his hand, saw the rotation, saw it coming in high and outside. The batter swung. Contact. The ball popped up, high and shallow toward third base. The third baseman drifted back. It was going to be an easy catch. The game was going to end with Team 2 winning 5-4. Except the third baseman misjudged it. The ball dropped behind him. Hutchins took off from second base. Morrison, coaching third, waved him home. The third baseman scrambled for the ball, threw home. The catcher, one of the Japanese soldiers, caught it and swept down for the tag. Hutchins slid. Dust exploded. Bodies collided. For a frozen instant, nobody knew the call. Then Tanaka's voice rang out. Safe! Tie game, 5-5. The batter had made it to first base. Another runner was on, 1 out. The game continued. The next batter struck out. 2 outs, still tied. Last chance. The final batter was Kobayashi. He walked to the plate slowly, bat in hand, looking like a man approaching his own execution. Morrison moved down the baseline toward third, close enough to see Kobayashi's face. The young Japanese soldier looked terrified, not of the pitch, of everything this moment represented. The first pitch came in, ball, outside. Second pitch, Kobayashi swung and missed. Third pitch, fouled back. The count was 1-2. Morrison found himself leaning forward, whispering under his breath, "Come on, come on." Fourth pitch, Kobayashi swung, made contact. The ball shot toward the gap between first and second base. The second baseman dove, got a glove on it, but the ball squirted free. The runner from first raced toward second. Kobayashi sprinted toward first base. The second baseman scrambled to his feet, threw to first. The ball and Kobayashi arrived at the same instant. The first baseman stretched. Kobayashi's foot hit the bag. Everyone held their breath. "Safe," Tanaka called. The runner from first had made it to third. Now there were runners on the corners. 2 outs. Tie game. Bottom of the 9th. The next batter was a former prisoner named Martinez. He'd been quiet all game, hadn't said a word to anyone, just played his position in left field and batted when his turn came. Martinez stepped into the batter's box. The pitcher looked exhausted. Everyone was exhausted, but nobody wanted this to end. First pitch, ball. Second pitch, ball. Third pitch, strike. Fourth pitch, strike. Fifth pitch, ball. Full count. Bases loaded would mean a walk would win it, or a strikeout would send it to extra innings. The pitcher wound up, threw. Martinez swung. The ball jumped off the bat. A line drive toward right field. Morrison watched it arc through the air, watched the right fielder race forward, watched the runner from third take off toward home. The right fielder dove, extended his glove. The ball hit the edge of the webbing and stuck. Out. Inning over. Game still tied. Extra innings. Nobody had planned for extra innings. Morrison looked at both teams. They were spent. Physically, emotionally, psychologically spent. But every single one of them wanted to keep playing. The 10th inning went scoreless. So did the 11th. In the 12th, Team 2 loaded the bases with 1 out, but a double play ended the threat. The sun was starting to set. Long shadows stretched across the field. Morrison knew they couldn't play much longer. It was getting hard to see. Everyone was running on fumes. Top of the 13th inning, Team 2 up to bat. A walk, a single, runners on first and second, 1 out. The batter hit a grounder to shortstop. Morrison, playing short, fielded it cleanly. He could get the lead runner at third, maybe turn 2, end the inning. He threw to third. The third baseman, one of the Japanese soldiers, caught it, tagged the bag, 1 out. He turned to throw to first for the double play, but he hesitated, just for a split second. Morrison saw him glance at his teammate running down the line, saw something cross his face, then he threw. The throw was late. The runner was safe at first, but they'd gotten the out at third. Runners on first and second, 2 outs. Next batter struck out. Inning over. Bottom of the 13th, Team 1's last chance before it got too dark to continue. The first batter grounded out. The second batter struck out. 2 outs. Last chance. Hutchins came to the plate, his 4th at-bat of the day. He doubled earlier, struck out once, grounded out once. Now, with the game on the line and darkness falling, he represented Team 1's final hope. The pitcher was one of the Japanese soldiers. He'd been pitching for 6 innings. His arm had to be dead, but he wound up and threw. Strike 1, right down the middle. Hutchins didn't swing. Ball 1, outside. Ball 2, inside. Strike 2. Hutchins swung and missed. The count was 2-2. Morrison found himself praying. To what, he didn't know. Just praying that something good would come from this. That this insane, impossible game would end the right way, whatever that meant. The pitcher wound up, threw. The ball came in high and tight. Hutchins started to swing, then checked. Ball 3. Full count. One more pitch. One more moment. The entire compound seemed to hold its breath. The pitcher threw. Hutchins swung. The sound of contact echoed in the dying light. The ball sailed high and deep toward the left center field gap. The outfielders raced back. The ball kept carrying. Higher. Deeper. It cleared the fence. Home run. Game over. Team won 6-5. For a moment, nobody moved. Everyone just stared as Hutchins rounded the bases in the near darkness. When he crossed home plate, his teammates mobbed him, Americans and Japanese together, celebrating a baseball game. Then something unexpected happened. The Team 2 players, the ones who just lost, started walking over, not to fight, not to protest, to shake hands. It started with one former prisoner offering his hand to one of the Japanese soldiers, then another, then another. Soon, both teams were intermingling, shaking hands, patting each other on the back. Not as friends, that would take a lot more than one baseball game if it could ever happen at all, but as players, as men who'd shared something strange and impossible, and somehow meaningful. Morrison stood at home plate watching this unfold. He saw Hutchins and Kobayashi standing near first base. They weren't talking, just standing there, exhausted, in the gathering darkness. Then Hutchins extended his hand. Kobayashi looked at it for a long moment, looked at Hutchins's face, and slowly, carefully, shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation. The horrors of the past couldn't be erased by a handshake, but it was acknowledgement. It was a first step towards something other than perpetual hate. Tanaka, the umpire, came over to Morrison. That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Morrison laughed, a sound of exhaustion and relief and something like joy. Probably both. You know this never officially happened, right? No reports, no records, just another day at the processing camp. I know. But those men will remember. Both sides. They'll remember that they played baseball together. And maybe, when the nightmares come, when the trauma hits, they'll remember that once, just once, they managed to be human together. Morrison nodded. He didn't have words for what had happened here, didn't have a framework to understand it, but he knew, in his bones, that something important had occurred on this field. The players dispersed slowly, back to their separate areas of the compound, back to the reality of their situations. Former prisoners heading toward transport home. Japanese soldiers heading toward uncertain fates. But as they walked away, Morrison noticed something. They walked differently, shoulders a little less tense, heads a little higher, like men who'd remembered, if only briefly, that they were more than their worst moments, more than the war had made them. The baseball equipment got packed away. The field returned to emptiness. Within a week, everyone had been processed and moved on. The camp closed, the war's machinery of repatriation and reconstruction ground forward. And officially, nothing unusual had happened on that field. No game, no moment of connection, just another processing point in the massive operation of ending a war. But the men remembered. In the decades that followed, some of them would tell the story, usually late at night, to close friends or family members who could be trusted with something this strange. They'd talk about the day they played baseball with the enemy, the day the war stopped for 9 innings, 13 innings actually, when the impossible happened and men who should have been consumed by hate instead played a game. Hutchins went home to Texas, struggled with what we now call PTSD for years, built a life, got married, had kids, and sometimes when things got dark, he'd think about that game, about the moment he shook Kobayashi's hand. It didn't erase the trauma, but it reminded him that healing, however impossible it seemed, might be possible. Slowly, gradually, one small step at a time. Kobayashi returned to Japan, to a country devastated and defeated and trying to rebuild from ashes. He never spoke much about the war, but in his later years, he told his grandchildren about playing baseball with American soldiers, about a lieutenant who made an impossible game happen, about the moment when he stood on a field and was just a player, not a defeated enemy. Morrison stayed in the military for another year, then went home to Ohio. He never played professional baseball again. Instead, he became a high school teacher and coach, and every season he'd tell his players about the most important game he ever played, about the game that taught him that even in humanity's darkest moments, connection is possible, understanding is possible, healing is possible. The story faded into obscurity for decades, a footnote in personal histories, a strange tale told at reunions and family gatherings. But historians eventually started piecing it together, interviewing survivors, finding scattered mentions in letters and diaries, reconstructing what happened on that field in August 1945. And what they found was this: the game shouldn't have happened. By every measure of military protocol, historical precedent, and common sense, it was impossible. The trauma was too fresh, the wounds too deep, the hate too justified. But it did happen, because one lieutenant had a crazy idea, because some men on both sides were desperate enough for normalcy to risk everything, because a baseball, a leather-bound sphere of cork and string, became a tool for remembering humanity. The game changed no official policies, rewrote no history books, made no immediate difference to the massive geopolitical shifts happening in the aftermath of World War II. But for the men who played, it mattered. It gave them a memory that wasn't about horror or suffering or hate. It gave them a moment when they transcended their circumstances and just played. That's the power of sport. Not to fix things, not to erase trauma, not to create instant healing or forgiveness, but to create moments of shared humanity, to remind us that even in our darkest hours, we are capable of seeing each other as something other than enemies, as players, as people, as human beings trying to survive in an impossible world. The field where they played is long gone, bulldozed and built over decades ago. No monument marks the spot. No plaque commemorates what happened. The game remains officially unrecorded, just a story passed down through families, a memory fading as the generation who lived it passes on. But the lesson remains. In the aftermath of unthinkable violence, when every instinct screams for continued hatred, there's another choice. Not forgiveness necessarily, not forgetting, but recognition, acknowledgement, the willingness to see the humanity in the other, even when that humanity has committed or endured terrible things. This is the story of the game that never should have happened, the game that broke every rule and defied every expectation, the game that proved that even after the deepest darkness, light can break through in the most unexpected ways. 9 innings, 13 really, that changed lives in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured, that gave men hope when hope seemed impossible, that reminded everyone involved that war makes monsters of us all, but it doesn't have to be permanent, that redemption, however slow and painful, is possible. One baseball game, one impossible afternoon, one moment when enemies became players and hatred gave way to something that looked, however briefly, like understanding. That's the story. That's the truth of what happened when a lieutenant made an insane decision and some men on both sides were brave enough to step onto a field together. And maybe, just maybe, that's the game we all need to remember. When the world feels dark and divided, when hatred seems justified and reconciliation impossible, when we forget that the people we oppose are also human. Sometimes healing starts with something as simple as a game, as impossible as a handshake, as unlikely as 9 innings of baseball between enemies who remembered just for a moment that they were something more. clay ball.